Okay, and let me hit the recording. And all right, well, welcome and thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to come in and hear what we have to say. We'd love to have your own say, so you can actually list your questions in the chat, and then I'll ask those questions to our panelists. And so why don't we start? This is the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and we're really pleased to have with us today in this election aftermath discussion our panelists. And I'm just going to name and briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. So our first panelist comes to us from Oregon. This is Professor Dr. Anita Chari, and she is a political theorist, a vocalist, and a writer based in Portland. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon and is the author of A Political Economy of the Senses, published by Columbia University Press just a few years ago. She's also published other books and articles, and so we welcome you, Professor Chari. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and our next guest is Professor Dr. Darrell Arnold, who is an assistant professor of philosophy and is the editor of Traditions of Systems Theory, which is published by Routledge, and Critical Theory and the Thought of Andrew Feenberg. Was Andrew Feenberg your advisor?
No, he wasn't. I just have been involved in philosophy of technology for a long time and got to know him through that.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, Darrell.
Thanks.
And our next guest is Professor Dr. Rocky Gangle, who is a full professor of philosophy at Endicott College, which is just north of Boston in Massachusetts. He's a distinguished research fellow with us here at GCAS, has written several books, including Diagrammatic Immanence, Category Theory, and Philosophy. Well, welcome, Rocco.
Thanks.
And then our penultimate guest is Professor Dr. Adam J. Graves, who received his PhD from the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania. He is currently a professor of philosophy at MSU Denver. What does MSU stand for?
Too many syllables to name. Metropolitan State University.
Okay, great. And so you're based in Denver, and you actually are the founding director of the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. And then our guests are this is the final guest for introducing us here is Alexandra Gilbert, who has her PhD and is the interim chair of the Comparative Literature Department here at GCAS and lectures widely on comparative literature, feminism, and post-structuralism. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hello.
Great. So let's get started. What do you all think of the elections, the fallout? Is it serious? Is it not so serious? Is it kind of a joke almost? What do you think, Rocco? What's your take on just the past couple of days?
Well, I think one thing that struck me, especially in the last 24 hours or so, is the way that the Republican opposition to the results has really taken the form of a kind of naked anti-democratic sentiment that the crowds, I think without even really realizing it, were chanting not just stop the count, but in some cases stop the vote, which is a strange, I think, psychoanalytic symptom that you wouldn't want to admit that you want to stop the vote. That just doesn't sound good. But I think they've gone. I think a sizable percentage of the supporters of the current president have entered something like a kind of political psychosis, that they truly believe that there's a vast conspiracy. Some of them believing in that there are satanic rituals going on. They've gone over the deep end, and I think that the question is how many? Is it? I mean, it certainly is a minority, but it's a sizable minority, and I think that there's worry that some of them will take some kind of violent action at some point if they believe this sort of thing, and if they get the message from the leaders that that this has been a fraud, America's destiny is at stake. There are people, I think, who would not deal with that in a reasonable and rational way.
Do you agree with Rocco's assessment, Professor Chari? I'm just curious. What's your take? Do you agree that it's jumped the shark? It's completely gone over the deep end. What's your position?
Well, absolutely, I agree with among certain elements in the Republican Party and on the right. There's I would absolutely agree that there's a level of collective delusion, and yes, that we could describe as psychosis. And I think the thing that interests me about this time is that in the midst of the pandemic that we're in, right? There's been such a necessity, among a large swath of the population to reckon with bodily vulnerability and really with, a level of, confrontation with mortality and death. And it has in some ways, I think, opened up certain things and certain conversations, certainly on the left. But then what I see, and I think so many people see this when we look at the results of the election and see that actually it's very close, right? There are a lot of people who have voted for Trump. And of course, some people saw this coming, that the polls were wrong the last time, that they were going to, for whatever reason, continue to be wrong this time, whether that be because of the kind of politics of shame around a kind of masculinity that is falling away right now in the midst of all the struggles or whatnot. We don't really know why those polls are so wrong. But what to me is so interesting and difficult is the fact that we have this opening, and then what's reflected back to us in this election result is that it's very close, and there's really a great amount of delusion among not a majority, but a high percentage of the American population that continues to vote for Trump in the midst of this. So, I can only say that is, I don't want to say surprising, but it's certainly it's deeply distressing that there's this kind of necropolitics, almost a kind of urge towards extinction that you see in that impulse. And I'm trying to get my head around it.
You raised the question about, or you raised the issue about the polling and the inaccuracy. And I know, Adam, you were tracking some polls there. And actually, I think you posted the Trafalgar conservative group that got it right in 2016 and was claiming that they're going to get it right this time. What's your position on the polls, and did they come out? What explains it to you, the difference?
Well, I mean, given the circumstances, I take no satisfaction in the fact that I think a lot of us are now in a position to kind of say, "I told you so." My view, I pretty much lost all faith in polling back in 2012 when I managed a congressional campaign in Minnesota. Came to the conclusion that basically internal polling, at least, served only really two functions. One, it was designed to get, it was designed to fundraise, to get people to open their wallets. And two, it was designed to convince candidates to spend money on TV ads effectively, which is where, I talk about the campaign industrial complex. And then I guess thirdly, there's another
ads. Adam, sorry to interrupt. What you said, PD ads? What's that?
I'm sorry, television ads.
Oh, TV ads. Okay.
Yeah, TV in the campaign industry. Most of the money is, of course, fueled through television ads. And the companies that produce those ads often have very close ties with the DCCC and with the polling firms. And so it's kind of this incestuous little kind of circle where people kind of, they begin by working maybe grassroots in a campaign, and then one day they work at the D-Trip, and then eventually they get the lucrative job at an advertising firm. Not to sound overly cynical about it, but there's I think there's some truth in that. I mean, if you just look at the candidates whose the Senate races that raised the most money, they were the two Senate races that, of course, turned out to be the least competitive, although you would have never guessed that from the polling, at least not the race against Lindsey Graham. But these are Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham are two characters that a lot of small dollar donors are willing to open their wallets up if they're told that there's a chance that we could defeat them. I'd hate to criticize anybody who was so generous as to contribute to those campaigns, but it's likely that resources could have been spent better elsewhere. But anyways, I think there's a lesson to be learned from the polling, and I agree with you, Rocky. There's a lot and with all of us, we have to diagnose. I mean, there's something really disheartening about the fact that Donald Trump said something true the other day. He said he received more votes than any Republican candidate running for office. In fact, he missed an opportunity to stroke his ego. It looks like he's going to have received more votes than any candidate in the history of our country, with the exception of his opponent, Joe Biden, more than Barack Obama in 2008. So my sense is that we have to look, the polling actually kind of does serve to underline a lesson that I think Democrats are going to have to learn. I mean, we, on the one hand, as a nation, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that 48% of the electorate voted for this guy after observing him in the White House for 4 years, and his incompetence and racism and xenophobia. But the Democrats are going to have to engage in some soul searching too, and I'm really worried about the lessons that are already being drawn from the outcome in Democratic circles. So this, the Congressional Caucus met either this morning or yesterday, then it was leaked to the media, and apparently you've got people, pretty powerful people in the Democratic Caucus, who are now worried that in fact it was the squad's fault that they underperformed, that it's this, it's the left wing of the party that's somehow weighing upon our electoral chances. And I think that basically comes from a complete misreading of the polls, and we can learn I mean, here's my view of the circumstance. What pollsters thought they got wrong in 2016, they thought they were able to correct in 2018. So they adjusted their models. Their polls for 2018 race were significantly closer, obviously, in 2016. What they didn't realize is that the wild card factor wasn't on the ballot. That is to say, Trump isn't on the ballot in 2018. Trump has an incredible ability to turn out low propensity voters that, quite frankly, are not tracking the political conversation. They're just not going to vote in a midterm, off-term election. So surprise, surprise, they were wrong again. They thought they adjusted their models properly. They thought they were weighting correctly the white, non-college educated turnout, but clearly they got it wrong again. One of the things this tells me is that the political establishment, the Democratic establishment, quite frankly, is continuing to think about this in terms of left-right politics. And there's, some truth to that. There's liberal versus conservative issues, and maybe the Democrats are moving too far to the left, and that's why we're losing. But I think another way to think about this, to really think about the landscape in American politics today, is that you can characterize it in terms of left-right, but you could also characterize it in terms of insider versus outsider. And I think Trump has this incredible power.
I would love to hear more from you, especially about, I think it was your father who ran for Congress and missed it by a few votes in Minnesota back a couple years ago. And I'd love to hear more about if that experience, maybe we can shed light on some of the close races that we're seeing in Georgia and Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So, but I want to get Darrell and Professor Gabbert in. Darrell, thank you, Adam. Darrell, I just listened to I really am a fan of your podcast, the Raven Speaks. I believe that's the name. And you and your partner on that podcast are excellent. I listened to the latest one, Halloween, in which you two were figuring different strategies that Trump might take and the dangers that lurk. And I wonder, given that we're now past the election day, if you think your diagnosis was right, and what was that diagnosis? What was your basic points to be alerted about and be warned about?
Well, I mean, I guess it's all part of the situation we have here, where Trump is accusing the Democrats of voter fraud in a situation where he has from the beginning known he has almost no chance to win the popular vote. So hasn't even really tried to do that. And what they've systemically tried to do is basically block people from voting. There's a systemic attempt here to steal the election, is basically what we are seeing. So in Florida, we have passed in 2018 an amendment so that felons could get the right to vote restored. That was basically interpreted by our governor that they, in such a way that they had to pay all their fines before that was possible. That excluded a lot of people from the vote. You had the whole fiasco with the post office. So all of this is in the run-up to the election, is essentially the attempt to steal the election. And it was very clear that Trump was not going to, with some kind of decency and respect for the political norms, admit if he had been defeated. So we knew he was going to come out with all these court cases. So we're seeing that play out. I mean, they're being dismissed right and left because there's just no standing. There's no evidence. So, I mean, one of them was dismissed in Georgia yesterday, where he was asking for the votes to be stopped because of the fraud. No evidence of fraud, so that was dismissed. In Pennsylvania, similarly today. So that's playing itself out. Now, the question is, you know, we had going up to this was, could he stop some state elections and basically defer that to the state legislatures so that they would decide the outcomes of these elections? But it doesn't look like anything like that is going to happen. I don't think he's going to have any ground if this were to go to a court. I don't think there's going to be anything there that he can really do. But what I'm wondering about is the reaction of this group of people that Rocco spoke about at the beginning. You know, these folks, I'm from Nebraska, and I have internet conversations with people who say, we're starting a civil war, that you voted for this communist and this socialist, and now we're starting a civil war. So what's hard to tell is what the reaction is going to be in the coming days and weeks by this group of people who are really disinformed and who simply aren't waiting for evidence, but will believe kind of whatever Trump tells them. And I mean, I see this in my own interactions with some of these folks on Facebook when I'm interacting with people from my home state. You see it here in Florida as well. And I don't know how that would play out. I don't think there's going to be anything Trump is going to be able to do, but that doesn't mean that this won't be extraordinarily messy. And what I actually expect is that he'll be like somebody evicted from his house who decides to, you know, tear out the toilets and bust up the bathtub and poke some holes in the walls. So he's going to try to sabotage the economy, and he's going to do what he can to ignore COVID even further so that Biden inherits an absolute mess. That's kind of what I expect to play out here. But I don't know what that factor is with some of his base who are really violent and who are really, really misinformed.
Absolutely. And they're looking for a fight. You know, you can just see it.
Right.
Let's go to Brazil, where Professor Gabbert is with us. And I know you're a dual citizen of the United States and Brazil. And you're also living in a context that's similar to Trump with your president. I wonder what kinds of observations you could bring to this discussion from the perspective of a woman and from Brazil. Yeah, I wonder what your observations might be.
Well, I guess that when we're thinking about democracy, I was reminded of if we would make when Rocky was talking about the collective hysteria, right? And I'm immediately reminded of these figures such as Trump and, you know, Salvini, Erdogan in Turkey, you know, Bolsonaro himself here in Brazil, of, you know, the emperor is nude, or the emperor without his clothes. And the anecdote when we're teaching children is that, you know, the little child comes up and points out and tells the collective masses, like, look, he has no clothes on. And everybody starts laughing. So that's the expected outcome, right? So yeah, people will notice the absurd. But however, I think in the case of these fascist leaders, we have this minority that decides to join the collective hysteria by either taking their clothes off as well and trying to reach another level of absurd. And this public spectacle of violence and ignorance and hysteria is calls more attention, right, than being rational and pondering things and being democratic. So I actually have some questions, maybe from an outside perspective, thinking very much like I've, you know, like
your mic, wherever your mic is.
Okay, I'm going to turn it off. Just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be great to hear some of your questions that you would like. It just, your mic
Is it better now?
Yeah, it's much better.
Better now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, could you hear what I said previously? But
Yes.
anyway,
Oh yeah, yeah.
I have some questions for the rest of the panel. Giving like someone who's from outside of the U.S. and gets, what's going in there too, especially for international students and people that are, not familiar with the American political system. So the first thing is, making a comparison, Brazil and the USA, voting here is obligatory. So when the dictatorship ended and they crafted a new constitution in 1988, since 1988, voting whether you want to or not, you have to go there. And even if you want to press, like, I'm not voting for anyone, you have to go there and you have to vote. Or also have a series of legal impediments, like, renewing your documents and things like that. And that has often been seen by a lot of the part of our population here in Brazil as anti-democratic, like, you're forced to vote. What if I don't want to vote, right? And while in the States, we have a whole other issue with that, where some people, they have to fight to vote. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Just a moment.
It sounds like somebody's dying to vote but can't, or a dog. Anyway, let's go back to Darrell. Go ahead, Darrell, and then we'll come back to Professor Gabbard.
Well, since the dog up, one of the things I've been thinking about is actually from the long view, and I don't want to get us carried away here, what this says about our preparedness for basically the upcoming climate crisis. Because yes. I think we have a crisis on the horizon that's going to challenge us more than we've been challenged, maybe than ever, even in the French Revolution or something like that. And the handling of the COVID virus, and then the ignorance about climate as it has played out in this election is not a hopeful sign. I mean, one of the good things is Biden can get back in the Paris Accord, and he can do that. But what we have is a third of the population that doesn't believe in anthropogenic caused climate change.
Yeah, and like 20% believe that there's a flat Earth. Are you kidding me? Like
so
how do you
have
deal with
a problem? And I think the fact that you had this contingent of people, half of the country, basically completely ignoring that's not on the radar at all. The fact that this COVID virus has been absolutely mishandled to the tune of 240,000 deaths and increasing. And that's not concerning enough to people that they want to get this guy out and get somebody into office who's going to rely more on the sciences and strategies that are informed by the best information.
Absolutely.
It's very concerning. It's very concerning for the country going forward, because we're going to have some Trump, maybe again in 4 years, or somebody like Trump trying to run. And look, they've seen this works. These kinds of antics function with a lot of the population.
Absolutely.
They get disinformation campaigns that, they're not in charge of. I mean, they're coming from Fox News. They're coming from dark money, Koch brothers funded think tanks and so on. This stuff's been going on for a long time.
Absolutely.
But it has worked really effectively. And we have people who simply don't have this stuff on their radar. And I think the issue of the 21st century is the impending climate crisis.
And whether or not we can address it in healthy ways. Let's go back to Professor Gabbard in Brazil. I was wondering, maybe you could pose one question to the panelists, or
Okay. So I'm sorry about the noise, but my question was, do we need to rethink the whole democratic process in the States? Like, perhaps make it digital, not to take so long, for these votes to be counted.
Okay, let's take that question. Let's go through the panel and ask Rocky, do you think we need to rethink the fundamentals of voting? What would that look like if you think so?
Well, I think at the very least, we need to rethink some of the technologies that we use. There was a ballot initiative in Massachusetts that unfortunately didn't pass, at least unfortunately from my point of view, which was a ballot choice initiative, which is really a quite straightforward procedure, which just means that instead of voting for a single candidate, if there's more than two, you rank the candidates according to choice. And then there's a reasonable algorithm such that if you, say, for example, in the previous election, Jill Stein, for the Green Party, got a sizable percentage of, a very small
Like
percentage, but
6%,
enough to make a
4%.
difference, somewhere in, I think, maybe the 3% range in some states, 2 to 3%. Well, there were a lot of people, I think, who would be drawn to that view, but they're not going to vote for her if they feel that that's basically giving a vote.
I see what you're saying.
But if you can choose her for number one and then put your second choice, if your number one choice isn't a winner, your number two choice counts.
Okay. What do you think?
One option, but in general, there are many different ways, especially given the technology that we have today. Voting, it's stunning to think that in a world in which we use the internet and drive cars and fly airplanes, we use voting technologies that basically were invented in the 18th century.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, go ahead, Anita.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think also it's not only just about the tech. I mean, I agree with the part at least about we need to be creative. I don't know specifically about, how I feel about ranked choice voting in particular, but I think, the idea that we have to be creative about the kinds of technologies that we use, and that what we do now is a holdover of the 18th century. And not only that, but the actual purpose of the Electoral College system in the United States was to disenfranchise. It's an anti-democratic system by design. And we can see, if you look at a map of the United States, it's quite obvious, right, that it's a disenfranchising system in which over and over again, and the Senate is too, right? We see that really means that a minority of the population is having an amount of impact that, is not rational. And so I think that certainly rethinking the Electoral College, but I think the problem is that we see that so many of the impediments to voting rights come in these in these formal procedures around which people's voting rights can be curbed. And we also see that the nature of contemporary neoliberalism makes it such that, people don't have time to vote, also given the system in the United States, right? I live in Oregon, where we actually have mailing voting for everybody. And, just that is a tremendous improvement over what we have in the United States. We saw what the debates were here, and it's insane given that a lot of the population isn't given the luxury to even have the time to take off work, to wait in line for 5 hours, or the monstrous amounts of time that people have been waiting in line to vote.
It's like a systematic voting suppression. I mean, think about it. On Tuesday, November, the first Tuesday of November, already you have, if you're poor or working class, it's hard to even get off work. And then when the lines are so long, forget it. There's a certain systematic voter suppression going on with that. What do you think, Adam? It's a good question that Professor Gabbard raised about, potentially rethinking the fundamentals of how we cast our votes.
I'm not so concerned about the technology necessarily, or the length of time it takes to actually count the ballots. I think what we're experiencing now is, it's anxiety inducing. There's obviously the potential of violence breaking out. But I think honestly, it doesn't really matter when the election's finally called, however the crazy Trumpers respond, they would have responded if it were called the night of. I think that there are a number of really interesting ideas that are being floated and actually even voted on. The one that Rocky mentioned about ranked choice probably, I think, stands the best chance it allows, I think it makes possible a real kind of emergence of third-party candidates or independent candidates who really don't stand a chance in national elections. So ranked choice is really interesting one. The national popular vote measure, which has been passed in a number of states, and I know it passed here in Colorado this election cycle, which basically would effectively eliminate the Electoral College, which has effectively the same impact as what Anita was mentioning with respect to the.
What does that mean, Adam? What does that mean?
So I mean, obviously the panelists all know this, but just for the sake of for students who maybe live abroad and don't track American politics as carefully, our president isn't chosen on the basis of popular vote, but rather on the basis of the Electoral College, which assigns a number of votes, electors, to each state. kind of roughly based on population, but only roughly. So in the last in the last 20 years, we've had at least 2 presidents lose the popular vote. In other words, they were not the candidate who received the most votes, and yet they won in terms of the electoral vote. So they became president, George W. Bush in 2000, of course, and Trump in 2016, who was beat by Hillary Clinton in terms of the popular vote by a pretty substantial margin, actually, in terms of sheer numbers. So, the national popular vote would basically, what it would do is it would say that the candidate who receives, so the state of Colorado has, is it 9 or 10? I can't remember, electoral votes to put into towards the presidential election. We would effectively now going forward assign all of those votes to the candidate who receives the most votes nationally. And this is a proposal that's triggered once a substantial number of states pass it, such that it would actually come into effect. You need 270 votes to win. So sorry for all of that. It's kind of, technical. Maybe I didn't do a great job explaining it, but I honestly never explained it before. So that was kind of off the cuff. But I think there are a couple other things I wanted to really say. In terms of the technologies, yes, I mean, obviously some of these, I imagine there are some really bad technologies out there, but I met back in 2018 with the head of the Colorado Elections Commissions. And he said that, Colorado has had mail-in ballot system for a while now, I think almost a decade, and it's very effective. I think people love it. It's increased the percentage of people who vote. I think I read somewhere that Colorado perhaps had the highest participation rate in the country this election cycle, partly because we're already used to getting our ballots mailed to us in advance and then we sign in. Now that does disenfranchise younger voters, people who either live with their parents and then go off to college or come back or moving around a lot because it's harder for the state to track them down to mail them their ballots. So there's some things that have to be worked out there, but by and large, it's quite effective. And the one thing that some people worry about, this head of elections commission said, is that there's a general sense that the people's trust in our election process would be undermined if we try to do it electronically, for example. If we having some kind of physical record of the vote seems to be tremendously important to people
because then you get into their trust in the outcome. You get into these issues of who makes the machinery diable and who funds it and what kind of party are they related to.
Yeah, and so concerns about hacking, concerns about what do you do when there's a recount. I mean, people just don't understand, electronic or, relics. I don't, for example. I have no idea how this machine in front of me works. So how do you do a recount under those circumstances? So there are questions like that. What really, I think the fascinating question that Alexandra brought up was, what would the American political landscape look like were we under a legal obligation to vote, so that there would be 100% roughly 100% participation in each election cycle. And it's been a longstanding assumption of the political left that higher turnouts favored Democrats. And I think that it's hard to know whether this election cycle confirmed that thesis or undermined it. So I'm curious what other people think, but I wanted to connect that back to something that Darrell had said before, mentioned, talking about disinformation campaigns and the fact that 30% of the American population doesn't believe in human contribution to climate change, or maybe even climate change at all. And what's crazy about that is, even though there is 30% of Americans who are, hold completely unscientific views, et cetera. Even a higher percentage of Congress holds these views, these crazy views. In other words, it's not, the ignorance isn't coming from the people, right, who live in, central Nebraska. The ignorance is being imposed upon the people who live in central Nebraska by their elected officials and the special interests, obviously, that they serve. Everyone on this panel understands that, but it's important to keep in mind as we try to address ourselves to these Trumpers. We have to understand that there's some kind of deep moral decay in our country. There's no question. It has to be addressed. But we have to do it in such a way that we're actually identifying the true causes.
And how do you do it? Is it through education? I mean, how do you address the moral decay issue?
That I don't have an answer
Go
to.
ahead.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have an answer to it, but what I do think is that there's this point at which we have to, okay, we have extremists in our society, there's no question, and there's violence, and there's an extreme amount of delusion right now that we could see with QAnon and these types of ideologies coming closer and closer into the mainstream in bizarre ways. But I think we also have to really look at how are we going to deal with the issue of communication amidst this kind of polarization? And I think educational institutions are really a big site in which this happens, because I think all of us teaching within universities, for example, have experiences of students who are trying to sort this out and are still are trying to individuate from their families and still have are working out their political positions and have some ideas around maybe being beholden to family views and voting for Trump, for example. And I'm not saying that voting for Trump means that you're inherently you need to be corrected and I know what you should do. I'm certainly not advocating that exactly, but I am saying that I think within educational institutions, we have to have a way of actually talking to all of our students, and I think it's a very difficult thing to be able to separate the human being from the political perspectives that we see going on. And we see that even with how freedom of expression and free speech, how it's being weaponized and how it's, we're having a hard time in our society actually being able to distinguish between speech and violence, which is a very scary thing. These are things that we actually have to teach, I think, and I think this is why GCAS actually is such a powerful initiative. But I think, when I think about how universities are not prioritizing the right things, they're not, in the midst of the pandemic now, we do have some opening in terms of really getting that teaching matters, pedagogy matters, our contact with one another matters. It's not just this abstraction that goes under the name of quote unquote research, right? It's that we really want to have social impact in our conversations. And I think that's actually a sea change. That's not something that was really being talked about at this level of depth a few years ago even. So I feel hopeful about it, but I think we need new tools. We need to learn how to communicate differently. We need to learn how to sense our bodies differently to deal with the collective trauma that we're sitting with. And we have to learn how to sit with the adversity that comes when you are dealing with somebody who has a political position that you actually find in some ways truly abhorrent.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that the beauty of the American experiment, if one wants to talk about that in an abstract, is that the whole idea is that we come from different nations and we have many different backgrounds and we have disagreements, but we're nonetheless function as a unit in terms of a nation state or a society, a civil society. And that's beautiful if you can get that dynamic to work. I love Martin Scorsese's film Gangs of New York, where it was exploring that, how Manhattan itself was a microcosm of these pluralistic worlds going on, these gangs, these different, the Italians, the Irish, all these, the African Americans, whatever. And how do you work out these great pluralities working in differences, but also together? That's the real question. It's a fundamental question about what America means, I think. What do you think, Darrell?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think that the Republican Party isn't really united so much on policy issues as they are on some kind of identity issues and maybe fear precisely of the kind of pluralism that you're talking about. I mean, the fact that this Trump campaign has functioned a second time with a large segment of the population on a Make America Great Again kind of campaign, or now Keep America Great, or whatever this was, right? So you have, I think, something that we see internationally as well. You have this kind of nationalism, this looking to like the tendencies of fascism, looking to a fictitious past as something that should ground us, and looking to preserve that culture, even if it's a fiction. And then with that, the kind of fear of the new, the fear of the immigrant. And I think that's what unites the party more than anything. It's interesting to see, when you look at the policies, people just, on Tuesday voted against the policies that they want. 62% of Americans think that a woman should have, in all or most cases, a right to an abortion. 67% support $15 an hour minimum wage. Despite that third that doesn't believe in climate change, 67% think that we need to do more on climate change. So you can just look at the policy level and you can see where America should be voting if they're voting in alignment with their own interests and what their own beliefs. But they're not. They're reacting to, I think, fear, which Trump and various people know how to stoke, and then retreating, to this kind of myth of the American past and this myth of a united, homogeneous American culture and so on.
Which is united, which intertwines, that myth that you're talking about intertwines really well with patriarchy, toxic masculinity, guns, these sense of like, I'm the tough guy and I will come, the Proud Boys, that whole ethos. And, what's dangerous about it is its inability to understand differences and being able to live together as a society among those differences. That's the key. And you're pointing this out very well. I was wondering, Professor Gabbard, if you could come on and talk to us about what you think, for looking from the outside, the future, the next, do you think fascism is going to take hold in a more recalcitrant way, a more grounded way? Is it going to grow, or is in some way Biden, Harris, is that a stopgap? Are we going to see a pivot here? What do you think the trajectory of this isolationism and fascism is, Professor Gabbard?
I think that perhaps, my brother often quotes authors. He says that the last century lived under the sign of fascism, and perhaps, fascism is just our more contemporary way of understanding violence. And a student of mine the other day made another very interesting observation. He said, how many people do you know whose grandparents actually had the chance to go to university, and learn about things outside of their communities and, that line of thought that they were always taught? So I'm a little bit, on the defensive with whatever results we're going to have. I read a political comment mentioning that on the first debate, right? They analyzed Biden and Trump as two senile old men shouting at each other. So I wonder if, these old white, not necessarily male, but like these old white elitist politicians are just, two sides of the same coin. Perhaps one is not as insane as the other. Perhaps they have more public gravitas and a sense of like public decency in public, but how are they really going to, to carry this out? Biden and Kamala are inheriting a very violent country.
Well, it is possible in 4 years. Biden's going to be 10 seconds younger than dust in 4 years. And as a result, we might have an African-American female president. That's cool. For me, that's a kind of a step forward in terms of sort of working with differences in real ways. But that also could precipitate a response, even a greater, more vitriolic response. But let's go to Rocco. Rocco, what's your take on, your understanding of fascism as it's emerged through 2016? What's your take on where we're going as a country?
It's obviously such a crucial question, and it's so hard to know what the parameters are for trying to think it. There's a very interesting study by German theorist Wilhelm Reich, the mass psychology of fascism. It's a very strange book, and he almost goes so far as to interpret the whole phenomenon of fascism through psychosexuality at the kind of collective level. And that seems like it's going a little bit over the deep end in a certain sense. But I think that in some sense, that's the right way to think about someone like Trump, as Darrell was pointing out, is really not in terms of policy. And one of the things that I find fascinating in talking to supporters of Trump is, if you're going to support the guy, it seems as if the reasonable rhetorical strategy would be to point out, look, I know the guy's a jackass, but look, he got us out of some wars. He's pursued a pretty coherent kind of isolationist, pro-business, environmentally destructive, but economically explosive, project of growth. I don't agree with those policies, but those are policies that are, from a certain right-wing perspective, defensible. The human being is not defensible. And yet, oddly enough, when you talk to reasonable supporters of this guy, it seems as if they go the other way. And they try to argue that, in fact, his personality isn't what it seems to be. And at least that's been, maybe it's just anecdotal, but my experience, and also, but I think in terms of public discourse that you see, strangely enough, the real draw of this guy seems to be the guy himself. And I think that what we need as critical intellectuals is to really think through this kind of collective psychological dynamic that is an intrinsic part of modern mass society, that the charismatic form of authority is with us. It didn't wither away with the rise of bureaucracy and with the rise of formal democracy. And in some sense, the more bureaucratic and structurally integrated with the economy our society becomes, I think the more likely we are to see these charismatic figures emerge. And I don't think we have good theoretical tools to really understand that. That might be a task that of our generation, is to really think through what's happening when we engage with these kind of phantasmic individuals in the public arena.
Go ahead, Adam.
Well, I was gonna say, Rocky, you provided a lot of the basis upon which I've been claiming that Trumpism isn't best understood in terms of right versus left, in part because it's not a matter of policy. It's not a matter of political concrete political ideas. It has to do with, you're right, this kind of the charisma of this character. And of course, it pains me to say it because I find the guy, I think, like everyone else, almost everyone I know, completely repulsive. But it's his ability to pass himself off as an outsider who's going to go to Washington and shake things up. There's a kind of anti-government sentiment that that's always been part of American politics, but I think has been exacerbated over the last couple of decades. And there's a book by Suzanne Mettler, I think is her name, at Cornell University, the title of which I think is The Submerged State, and where she argues basically that during the neoliberal era, basically from the mid to late 70s onward, a lot of state programs, this is, by the way, connecting back to something Darrell, you'd said earlier about how people, vote against their own best interests. And this is something that, coastal elites have been saying for years, and it's true. But why do they, right? Why do they? Well, there's been this concerted effort by both the Republicans and increasingly the Democrats to basically hide government programs behind private enterprises. So, for example, probably the best known example from the Obama era would be the elimination of the public option as a point of debate, right, in the debate surrounding Obamacare, so that what you still have the private insurance company basically kind of standing as the middleman between you and your healthcare. There's all kinds of examples: student loans, federal education tax credits, mortgage interest subsidies. But when we ran against Michelle Bachmann, who's the candidate we ran against back in Minnesota in the 6th district, one of the great things is she had this fake faux science clinic, pray away the gay kind of clinic. And crazily enough, some huge percentage of her patients would pay with with Medicare. And so her entire practice was propped up on government subsidies. And she was running an anti-government campaign. They're completely disconnected. But see, there's that private business, her clinic. She was a businesswoman. She passed herself off as a businesswoman. So this effort to kind of submerge the good that government does for those people in the middle of America behind the curtain of private enterprises has allowed especially folks like, Trump and other Republicans to basically make government out to be this bad thing that has to be stopped. And I'm not too worried about fascism as such. I mean, it is disconcerting that you look around the world, you see Bolsonaro, you see Modi in India, and you do see that we are kind of entering into a phase of kind of quasi-fascism, a little bit different from, 20th century fascism, because you don't have it's not the government somehow to overtaking the private sector, but rather it's the government basically being a puppet of the private sector, but this kind of the reemergence of these charismatic figures whose kind of entire platform is based on xenophobia and othering. That's disturbing. I hope and pray that there's not going to be another charismatic figure of Trump. Sorry, my sense is it's surprising to me right now, and I'm sorry I'm wandering a bit, but it's surprising how few Republicans are peeling away from Trump. It's obvious he's going to lose this election. Right? I'm surprised the media hasn't called it just because they're trying to be, diplomatic. Yeah. But you'd think that there'd be more kind of mainstream establishment Republicans starting to peel away their support with, public statements. Of course, you've got the Mitt Romneys and Mitch McConnell's playing it safe, but I would expect that to happen. And once Trump is gone, there's, I'm hoping he's gone for good.
Yeah, let's see. Anita.
I'd like to speak to something that Rocco said, because I think, and I think it's related to what you've been speaking about, Adam, but, to understand within the broader public sphere also the dynamics, the psychological dynamics around the orientation towards pleasure, because I think that's actually something that plays into this whole charismatic politics, but I don't think it's just about charisma. I think the other aspect of neoliberalism that we can talk about would be, along the lines of a kind of Nietzschean analysis, would help us to see that there's this way in which people have mobilized around Trump with these orgies of feeling, as Nietzsche calls it, as a way of kind of anesthetizing a kind of a pain that comes from living in this society that's deeply unsustainable and mechanical, and in which labor, is not pleasurable, and in which we work too much. And, I think, if you think about something like Herbert Marcuse along these lines too, thinking about how that plays in when you have this repetition of a lack of, pleasurable gratification in our society. You see things like the opioid epidemic as being an expression, I think, of this deeper level of a need to anesthetize from a pain that is extreme. And so I think that all that also is the other side of understanding, something of a development towards fascism, which is not only to be understood within the locus of Trump as a charismatic figure, nor only as a kind of discussion about the relationship between the government and the public sphere and the private sphere, basically, in neoliberalism, right? Although I think those are crucial elements, but I think alongside that, then we want to think about, wow, we have a society in which our relationality is deeply challenged, right, and deeply attenuated. And we see that in the pandemic coming to a head, but it's really more, in a weird way, it's more of the same, right? I think many of us had this feeling with the pandemic, and the feeling of like, oh, now we only get to do this thing where we see each other on screens and we don't get to actually touch each other. But we were already living in a society that was deeply deprived in terms of our capacities to relate and touch one another and feel.
And part of what you do, apart from just being a professor at the University of Oregon, is don't you have your own like yoga connection, or what is it that you do outside of teaching? And I wonder, does that relate to to the touching, to the connection side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a big part of my work is, I bring like trauma-informed and somatic work into, not only into universities, but I do work, privately with people, but I also work on it at a kind of political level, in the sense of, not in an activist way exactly, but as a like another level of conversation around what happens when we actually don't feel like things are going well in our lives. It's not, we see in neoliberalism, there's a real privatization of affect. And I think so much of what we want to talk about and participate in, even when it comes to personal healing, is really that we live in a society in which is extremely ungratifying, and where our being cut off from politics or having these very narrow venues in which politics can occur is deeply deeply distressing, and it's horrible for us.
Where does
right?
it
And
all
means,
go if it's going to go inside? Eventually, you explode, right? I mean, that's an interesting. Wow, it's absolutely fascinating. We're actually nearing our time for the hour, but I wanted to go back through everybody and just to have a brief, maybe 1 minute summation, if you want. But you have to start it out by saying, do you think Bernie Sanders would have won? Brocco.
I don't know. I would love to live in the multiple time stream universe where I could go and try it again and see. I really wish, because I think we would learn a lot about America to see that play out, but it's lost to us.
Any final words? What do you think?
I hope as Adam was pointing out, that the Republicans, many of whom have some degree of integrity, even if they've hidden it behind their cravenness for the last 4 years, and they need to find that again. I mean, I'm not on board with the Republican platform and ideology. Of course, they don't even have a platform anymore. But some of them need to come back, and we need a robust Republican Party in America, because it's a very conservative country. And if the conservative party is not made up of people with integrity, who are actually committed to the vision of conservatism, then it's not going to work.
Thank you. Professor Gabbard, would Bernie Sanders have won? And do you have any final words of wisdom and potential diagnostic?
No, well, I do not believe he would have won. One of the main reasons that I think that way is that he has never supported the firearms industry. So I think just like positioning yourself against this prerogative already kind of like, cuts you out of the race. So that's my personal opinion. But then I would like Adam to comment a little bit. Like, I want to believe that we'll never have someone as bad as Trump again, but we might have someone even worse, depending on the turnout of things. So how can we like prepare for that without, becoming a totally, let's say, a person without any kind of political belief, right, in their lives?
Creston, do you want me to make my final comment in response to both your question and Alexandra's?
Yeah, good luck. Go for it.
And I just realized I've been calling you by your last name, haven't I? Or not?
Anyway, I don't know.
Okay, so no. So yeah, I think that the left has to figure out a way to address what's now known as kind of shit life syndrome. The experience of these people who, of kind of middle Americans who've turned to the opioids and the kind of euphoric experience of supporting a fascist like Trump. We've got to figure out a way to do it. And I don't think the way to do it is simply to pivot to the middle the way that Biden did. I mean, we're just squeaking by. I mean, I'm obviously grateful that we're gonna, that he's gonna win. But look at the margins here. We're not talking about there's no blue wave, right? And I think the Democrats got really, really lucky that this kind of milquetoast campaign, which hardly had a message other than don't vote for me instead of Trump, because it was pretty much all about the pandemic, didn't refer to much else about it wasn't a policy-based campaign.
Quick question, Adam, do you think without COVID Trump would have been reelected?
Absolutely, no question. I think Trump would have been unstoppable without COVID, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not sure anyone could have beat him had it not been for COVID. I think Bernie would have stood a chance. I think he would have won by larger margins in the Rust Belt states, probably might have lost a couple. He might have lost Arizona, certainly would have lost Florida. I think, unfortunately, the boomer generation has effectively passed down like a genetic disease to the next generation, the fear of socialism. So I think the left we have to figure out better ways to articulate our, we have to more politically savvy ways of articulating policy positions, and just kind of our general orientation that might appeal to these people who turned out for Trump in such massive numbers.
Do you have any aspirations for running for office one day?
No, I have friends who have aspirations for me to run for office.
Yeah, it just seems like, given your father's your background and all that, I don't know.
No,
Okay.
that was kind of my my eureka moment that I would never do so. I think.
Really? Okay. Well, thank you, and I guess we'll go to Darrell, and then we'll finish up with Anita. Darrell, would Sanders have won?
He wouldn't have won in Florida. Adam was right about that. You know, you saw just what's unbelievable is that this messaging down here stuck in Florida. And so Shalala and Powell, these two Congress women from the Miami area, lost their seats to Republicans, despite being at odds with the policy issues. I think that and Trump's machismo played out pretty well down here in certain respects, but I don't know if Bernie would have won. I guess my closing words though are that it's a pity that Bernie didn't win, because I think the climate crisis that we're going to confront requires something much more imaginative and much more basic kinds of changes than we're going to see under Biden, I think. So I guess one other thing I would say was I was surprised by this result. I thought that Trump was going to take a little more of a thumping by moderates, you know, because I thought Americans, I was convinced Americans liked their fascism abroad only, and that was the only fascism we were going to support, that we were not going to do that at home. Yeah. But I was surprised.
Yeah, but in the end, it looks like Biden's going to win, and it'll be interesting to see the soap opera drama, the child flailing around in the Oval Office for a couple months. But thank you, Darrell, and we'll end tonight with Anita. Unless, Adam, did you want to come right quick in before?
Oh, no, I was going to say that maybe the only satisfying thing about this election is that we get to watch Trump squirm now.
What did Anderson Cooper say? A fat tortoise on his back flailing in the sun, something like this. That was hilarious. That was great. Go ahead, Anita.
On the Bernie question, I don't know. My sense, especially given the election result, is probably no. I don't really have a lot of faith in a lot of members of the society to vote for an agenda that is more progressive, and but I also don't necessarily trust my own perception of what the dynamics are in the United States, and I think that's many of us feel that way after seeing how, just as Darrell was saying, like Trump didn't suffer much at all from having been the president during the pandemic, and this insane number of people and the amount of devastation, the amount of people who have died. And to me, that is beyond sobering, that it took a level of catastrophe that big to squeeze that little of a margin is terrifying to me. And it really makes me think, like, what will be a wake-up call for the United States to really perceive what truly is, what truly we need to sustain humanity, and what we need to do to not, bring about, a situation of environmental collapse, of social collapse. It's really something I'm sitting with and continuing to.
Wow, that's really insightful, what you're saying there. Yeah, it took something so big like COVID to get us to that slim margin that we're seeing. Wow, I never thought about that, but that's very, really ominous, daunting, and helpful. But It's been really great to spend the last hour with all of you. I'm sorry we didn't have, it felt to me like we needed to spend more time with maybe fewer people for longer periods of time, so we could sort of flesh out things. But maybe we can set something like that up next time. But I really appreciate all of you for being part of this, and thanks for the wisdom and the insights, the analyses.
Thank you, Creston, for putting this together on
Thanks
such.
for having us all.
Thank you all. It was such a
Thanks,
pleasure
everyone.
to talk with
I
you all.
learned a lot from you guys. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so we'll stay in touch and be safe, and let's entertain ourselves watching this soap opera unfold. All right, but be well, everybody. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.